She was a woman of grace and dignity, sold like a mere object to the most feared king in all of Romania. He ruled with an iron fist, showing no mercy, until she stepped into his life. What happens when a heart of stone begins to crack? And will love be strong enough to survive in a world that forbids it? Watch until the end to uncover a story filled with passion, sacrifice, and the power of destiny. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and why do you love these stories? The bitter wind howled through the narrow streets of Bucharest, mirroring the turmoil in Elisabeta Ionescu's heart. At 38, she had never imagined her life would come to this, being sold to the most feared man in all of Romania. King Darius Moldoveanu, a ruler whose very name sent shivers down the spines of his subjects, was to be her new master. As the carriage rattled along the cobblestone streets, Elisabeta clutched her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. The weight of her family's debts pressed heavily upon her, a burden she had willingly shouldered to save them from ruin. Yet the price of their salvation was her own freedom. "We're almost there, my lady," the elderly driver called back, his voice tinged with sympathy. Elisabeta managed a weak smile in response, though her heart pounded with dread. "Thank you," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the approaching silhouette of the royal castle. Its spires pierced the gray sky like accusing fingers, a stark reminder of the power that awaited her. The imposing structure loomed before her, growing more intimidating with each passing moment. Elisabeta swallowed hard, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She had heard tales of the king's cruelty, of his iron-fisted rule, and the coldness that emanated from him like a winter frost. As the carriage came to a halt, Elisabeta took a deep breath, smoothing her simple dress with trembling hands. A guard roughly pulled her from the vehicle, his grip bruising on her arm. "Move along," he growled, propelling her towards the castle entrance. "Please," Elisabeta said, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's no need for such force. I came here willingly." The guard's eyes narrowed, but his grip loosened slightly. "Willingly or not, you're here now. Best remember your place, woman." The great doors swung open, revealing a world of opulence that took Elisabeta's breath away. Marble floors gleamed beneath her feet, and tapestries depicting heroic battles adorned the walls. Yet despite the grandeur, an unmistakable chill permeated the air, a coldness that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. Elisabeta was led through winding corridors, the whispers of servants and courtiers following in her wake. She caught snatches of their conversations, laced with fear and curiosity about the king's newest acquisition. "Another one for His Majesty's collection," a noblewoman whispered behind her fan. "She won't last a week," her companion replied with a sneer. Elisabeta's cheeks burned with shame, but she held her head high, determined not to let them see her weakness. She had made this choice to save her family, and she would face the consequences with dignity. At last, they reached the throne room. The massive doors creaked open, revealing a cavernous space dominated by a single imposing figure. King Darius Moldoveanu sat upon his throne, a study in stillness and authority. His piercing blue eyes, cold as the depths of a frozen lake, swept over Elisabeta without a flicker of emotion. Elisabeta felt her breath catch in her throat as she took in the king's appearance. Despite the tales of his cruelty, she couldn't deny his striking features: the strong jaw, the raven-black hair streaked with distinguished silver at the temples. Yet it was the utter lack of warmth in his gaze that truly chilled her to the bone. "Your Majesty," the guard announced, shoving Elisabeta forward. "The woman from the Ionescu family, as requested." Darius said nothing, his eyes boring into Elisabeta with an intensity that made her want to shrink into herself. She forced herself to meet his gaze, summoning every ounce of courage she possessed. For a moment she thought she saw a flicker of something in those icy depths. Surprise, curiosity. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her to wonder if she had imagined it. The silence stretched on, becoming almost unbearable. Finally, Elisabeta gathered her courage and spoke. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I am here to serve, as agreed upon, to settle my family's debts." The king's eyebrow arched slightly, the first sign of any reaction. You speak when not spoken to, he observed, his tone flat and dispassionate. Elisabeta's heart raced, fearing she had already made a grave mistake. Forgive me, Your Majesty. I meant no disrespect. You will serve in the kitchens, the king finally declared, his voice as cold and unyielding as a midwinter night. Disobedience will not be tolerated. You are here to work, nothing more. Do you understand? Elisabeta nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The king's dismissive tone cut deeper than she had expected, reminding her of her new status as little more than property. I asked if you understood, Darius repeated, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. Yes, Your Majesty, Elisabeta managed to respond, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. I understand completely. As she was led away, Elisabeta couldn't shake the feeling of the king's eyes following her. She glanced back just for a moment and caught him still watching her with that same inscrutable expression. A shiver ran down her spine, equal parts fear and something she dared not name. The days that followed were a blur of endless tasks and whispered gossip. Elisabeta threw herself into her work, scrubbing pots until her hands were raw and chopping vegetables until her eyes stung with exhaustion. Yet no matter how hard she worked, she couldn't escape the oppressive atmosphere of the castle or the lingering fear of the king's unpredictable moods. She caught glimpses of Darius occasionally, a flash of his cloak as he strode down a corridor, the echo of his voice giving commands to his advisors. Each time, her heart would race, though whether from fear or something else, she couldn't say. The other servants watched her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. One evening, as Elisabeta was finishing her duties in the kitchen, an older woman named Mariana approached her. You're holding up well, Mariana observed, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. Many don't last this long in the king's service. Elisabeta paused in her work, offering a small smile. I have no choice but to endure, she replied softly. My family's future depends on it. Mariana nodded sympathetically. Just keep your head down and do as you're told. The king, he's not a man to be trifled with. Before Elisabeta could respond, a royal guard appeared in the kitchen doorway. You, he pointed at Elisabeta. The king requires your presence. A hush fell over the kitchen as all eyes turned to Elisabeta. Mariana's face paled, and she squeezed Elisabeta's arm. Be careful, she whispered urgently. Confusion and trepidation warred within Elisabeta as she followed the guard through the twisting passages of the castle. What could the king want with her? Had she somehow displeased him already? They stopped before an ornate door, and the guard knocked once before pushing it open. Enter, came the king's voice from within, as cold and commanding as ever. Elisabeta stepped into what appeared to be a private study, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive desk, and there, silhouetted against the flickering firelight, stood King Darius himself. Your Majesty, Elisabeta murmured, dropping into a deep curtsy. How may I serve you? Darius turned to face her, his expression unreadable. You are educated, are you not? He asked abruptly. Startled by the unexpected question, Elisabeta hesitated before answering. Yes, Your Majesty. My father believed in the importance of learning, even for his daughters. A fleeting expression, approval, interest, crossed the king's face before vanishing. You will read to me, he stated without preamble, gesturing to a chair near the fire. Each night, until I dismiss you. Elisabeta's mind reeled at the unexpected command. As she took her seat, hands trembling as she accepted the book he thrust towards her, she couldn't help but wonder, what game was the king playing? And more importantly, what would be the cost of losing? Begin, Darius commanded, settling into a high-backed chair across from her. Elisabeta opened the book, a collection of ancient myths and legends, and began to read. Her voice, initially shaky, grew stronger as she lost herself in the tales of heroes and monsters, gods and mortals. As she read, she became aware of the king's intense gaze upon her. When she dared to glance up, she found his eyes fixed on her face, a strange intensity burning in their depths. It was as if he was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. Hours passed, marked only by the turning of pages and the crackling of the fire. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Darius held up a hand. "Enough," he said, his voice oddly quiet. "You may go." Elisabeta rose, her legs stiff from sitting for so long. As she made her way to the door, the king's voice stopped her. "You will return tomorrow night," he said, not a request, but a command. "As you wish, your majesty," Elisabeta replied, dipping into a curtsy before slipping out of the room. As she made her way back to the servants' quarters, Elisabeta's mind whirled with questions. What had just happened? Why had the king chosen her for this task? And why, despite everything, did she feel a strange flutter in her chest at the thought of returning to his presence? Little did she know this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, about love, and about the man they called the cruelest king in all of Romania. The early morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Elisabeta was roused from her fitful sleep. Her first night in the castle had been filled with restless dreams, echoes of the king's voice and the weight of his gaze following her even into slumber. As she dressed in the simple servant's garb provided to her, she couldn't shake the lingering sense of unreality that cloaked her new life. "You there, new girl!" a sharp voice called out as Elisabeta made her way to the kitchens. She turned to see a stern-faced woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. "I'm Mrs. Popescu, the head housekeeper. You'll report to me each morning for your duties. Understood?" Elisabeta nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Elisabeta Ionescu." Mrs. Popescu's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ah, yes. The special acquisition." Her tone made it clear what she thought of Elisabeta's position. "Well, don't expect any special treatment here. You'll work just as hard as everyone else, if not harder." "Of course," Elisabeta replied, straightening her shoulders. "I'm here to serve, nothing more." The housekeeper seemed to approve of this response. "Good. Now, get to the kitchens. There's bread to be baked and floors to be scrubbed before the castle wakes." The kitchen was already a hive of activity when Elisabeta arrived. Fires roared in massive ovens, and the air was thick with the scent of baking bread and simmering stews. She was immediately put to work kneading dough, her muscles protesting the unfamiliar labor. As she worked, Elisabeta couldn't help but overhear the whispered conversations around her. The king's name was on everyone's lips, spoken in hushed, fearful tones. "Did you hear?" One young maid whispered to another. "His Majesty threw Lord Balan out of court yesterday. They say he'll be stripped of his lands." "Serves him right," her companion replied. "He should know better than to question the king's decisions." Elisabeta's hands stilled for a moment as she absorbed this information. The cruel reputation of King Darius seemed well earned, yet she couldn't reconcile it with the man who had sat in rapt attention as she read to him the night before. As the morning wore on, Elisabeta's arms ached from the constant work. She was in the midst of scrubbing the stone floor when a familiar face appeared, Mariana, the kind older woman from the previous evening. "How are you holding up, dear?" Mariana asked, offering Elisabeta a sympathetic smile. Elisabeta sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow. "It's different from what I'm used to," she admitted, "but I'll manage." Mariana nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. Now, tell me." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "What happened last night, when the guard came for you?" Elisabeta hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "The king, he asked me to read to him," she said finally. Mariana's eyes widened in surprise. "Read to him? That's unusual. He's never shown interest in such things before." Before Elisabeta could respond, a commotion near the kitchen entrance drew their attention. The crowd of servants parted, revealing none other than King Darius himself, flanked by his personal guards. The kitchen fell silent, save for the crackling of fires and the nervous shuffling of feet. Darius's cold gaze swept the room, finally landing on Elisabeta. She felt her heart skip a beat as their eyes met. "You," he said, his voice carrying easily in the hushed room. "Come with me." Elisabeta rose shakily to her feet, aware of the stunned stares of her fellow servants. She followed the king out of the kitchen, feeling the weight of 100 curious gazes on her back. Darius led her through the winding corridors of the castle, his long strides forcing Elisabeta to hurry to keep up. They arrived at a small, secluded courtyard, bathed in the warm light of the late morning sun. "Your Majesty," Elisabeta began hesitantly. "How may I serve you?" Darius turned to face her, his expression as inscrutable as ever. "You will walk with me," he stated, offering no further explanation. They began to circle the courtyard, an awkward silence stretching between them. Elisabeta's mind raced, wondering what purpose this strange summons could serve. Finally, the king spoke. "You are not what I expected," he said, his tone neutral. Elisabeta glanced at him, surprised. "In what way, Your Majesty?" "You're educated, refined, not the typical payment I receive for settling debts." Elisabeta felt a flash of indignation at being referred to as mere payment, but she swallowed it down. "My father believed that education was important for all his children, regardless of gender," she explained. "He taught us to value knowledge and culture." Something flickered in Darius's eyes. "Curiosity, perhaps? And yet he sold you to settle his debts," he observed coldly. "He had no choice," Elisabeta defended, her voice stronger than she intended. "Our family was facing ruin. I volunteered." Darius stopped walking, turning to face her fully. For a long moment, he simply studied her, as if trying to solve a particularly vexing puzzle. "You sacrificed yourself for your family," he stated, not a question, but an observation. "Yes," Elisabeta replied softly. "Wouldn't Your Majesty do the same for those you love?" As soon as the words left her mouth, Elisabeta regretted them. She had overstepped, spoken too familiarly to this feared monarch. She braced herself for his anger, but to her surprise, Darius merely looked thoughtful. "Love," he said, as if tasting the word. A foolish notion, often used to justify even more foolish actions. Before Elisabeta could respond, the king abruptly changed the subject. "You will continue to read to me in the evenings," he declared. "But during the day you will assist my personal scribe. Your education should not go to waste on menial kitchen tasks." Elisabeta blinked in surprise. Thank you, Your Majesty. That's very kind of you." Darius's expression hardened. "Do not mistake this for kindness," he warned. "I simply prefer to make efficient use of the resources at my disposal. You are still here to serve, nothing more." With that, he turned on his heel and strode away, leaving Elisabeta standing alone in the courtyard, her mind whirling with confusion and a strange, inexplicable hope. As she made her way back to the servants' quarters to change for her new duties, Elisabeta couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The king, it seemed, was not quite the unfeeling monster she had been led to believe. There were depths to him, hidden beneath that icy exterior, and despite herself, she found she wanted to know more. The rest of the day passed in a blur of new tasks and faces. The royal scribe, a wizened old man named Theodore, welcomed her assistance with gruff kindness. As she helped him organize and transcribe official documents, Elisabeta caught glimpses of the inner workings of the kingdom. Trade agreements, diplomatic correspondence, and reports from the far-flung corners of Romania. Throughout it all, she felt the weight of the king's gaze upon her. He would appear suddenly in doorways or at the end of corridors, watching her with that same inscrutable expression before vanishing again. Each time, Elisabeta's heart would race, a mixture of fear and something else she dared not name. As evening approached, Elisabeta made her way to the king's private study, her steps both eager and hesitant. She knocked softly on the ornate door. "Enter," came Darius's voice from within. Elisabeta stepped inside, finding the king seated at his massive desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and ancient-looking tomes. He looked up as she entered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Relief, anticipation. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Your Majesty," Elisabeta said, dropping into a curtsy. "I'm here to read to you, as requested." Darius nodded, gesturing to the chair by the fire, the same one she had occupied the night before. "Begin where we left off," he commanded, rising from his desk to take his own seat across from her. As Elisabeta began to read, she found herself acutely aware of the king's presence. His eyes never left her face, drinking in every word as if they were water in a desert. The tales of ancient heroes and mythical beasts seemed to come alive in the flickering firelight, and more than once Elisabeta thought she saw Darius lean forward slightly, completely engrossed in the story. Hours passed, marked only by the turning of pages and the occasional crackle of the fire. When Elisabeta's voice began to grow hoarse, Darius held up a hand. "Enough for tonight," he said, his tone softer than she had ever heard it. As Elisabeta rose to leave, gathering her courage, she spoke. "Your Majesty, may I ask a question?" Darius arched an eyebrow but nodded his assent. Why do you want me to read to you?" Elisabeta asked hesitantly. "Surely there are others more qualified, with finer voices or greater skill." For a long moment Darius was silent, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully measured. "Your voice, it reminds me of someone I once knew, someone long gone." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Elisabeta's heart ached at the flash of pain she saw in the king's eyes, gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Thank you for sharing that with me, Your Majesty," she said softly. "I'm honored to serve in this way." Darius nodded once, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. As Elisabeta left the study, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The cruel king, it seemed, was not as impenetrable as she had once believed. And despite all reason, she found herself wanting to know more, to unravel the mystery of the man behind the icy facade. Little did she know, this curiosity would lead her down a path that would change not only her life, but the very fate of the kingdom itself. The days began to blend together as Elisabeta settled into her new routine at the castle. Each morning, she would assist Theodore, the royal scribe, with his duties, her quick mind and neat handwriting proving invaluable. In the evenings, she would read to King Darius, their nightly sessions becoming a strange sort of sanctuary for both of them. As autumn deepened, painting the castle grounds in rich hues of gold and crimson, Elisabeta found herself becoming more attuned to the king's moods. Though he remained outwardly cold and distant, she began to notice subtle shifts in his demeanor, a slight softening around his eyes when she entered the room, a barely perceptible relaxation of his shoulders as she read. One evening, as Elisabeta made her way to the king's study, she overheard hushed voices coming from around the corner. Instinctively, she slowed her steps, listening. "Cannot continue like this, Your Majesty," a man's voice insisted. "The people grow restless. They speak of your eccentricities." "My eccentricities are none of their concern, Lord Dragomir," came Darius's icy reply. "I rule as I see fit." "But, sire, your refusal to take a queen, to secure an heir, it breeds instability, and now this fascination with a common servant girl." Elisabeta's heart skipped a beat. Were they talking about her? "Enough!" Darius's voice cracked like a whip. "You forget yourself, Dragomir. Do not presume to dictate my personal affairs." Heavy footsteps approached, and Elisabeta quickly ducked into an alcove, her pulse racing. She watched as Lord Dragomir, a portly man with a neatly trimmed beard, stormed past, his face flushed with anger. Taking a deep breath to compose herself, Elisabeta continued on to the king's study. She knocked softly, entering when bidden. Darius stood by the window, his back to her, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. "You're late," he said, not turning around. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," Elisabeta replied, dipping into a curtsy even though he couldn't see it. "I lost my way." The king turned then, his piercing gaze searching her face. For a moment Elisabeta feared he knew she had overheard his conversation with Lord Dragomir, but he merely nodded, gesturing to her usual chair. As Elisabeta began to read, she couldn't help but notice the distraction in Darius's eyes. His mind seemed far away, troubled by thoughts she could only guess at. On impulse, she paused in her reading. "Your Majesty," she said hesitantly, "is everything all right?" Darius's eyes snapped to her face, surprise evident in his expression. "You presume much to question your king," he said. but there was no real heat in his words. Elisabeta swallowed hard but pressed on. "Forgive me, sire, it's just, you seem troubled, and I thought perhaps it might help to speak of it." For a long moment Darius simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, to Elisabeta's amazement, he let out a soft chuckle, the first time she had ever heard him laugh. "You are a strange one, Elisabeta Ionescu," he said, shaking his head. "Most would cower in fear at the mere thought of addressing me so familiarly." "Perhaps I'm simply foolish, Your Majesty," Elisabeta replied with a small smile. "Perhaps," Darius agreed, but there was a warmth in his eyes that belied his words. He was silent for a moment, then spoke again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Tell me, Elisabeta, what do you know of my reputation among the people?" Elisabeta hesitated, unsure how to answer. I've heard stories, Your Majesty. They say you rule with an iron fist, that you never smile." "And do you believe these stories?" Darius asked, his gaze intense. Elisabeta paused, choosing her words carefully. "I believe there is often more to a person than what others see on the surface." Something flickered in Darius's eyes. Approval, perhaps. "A diplomatic answer," he said, "but not, I think, an entirely honest one." Elisabeta took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "The truth, Your Majesty? When I first came here, I was terrified. The stories I'd heard, they painted you as a monster. But now," she met his gaze steadily, "now I see a man. A complex, often difficult man, but a man nonetheless, not a monster." Darius stood abruptly, turning back to the window. For a heart-stopping moment, Elisabeta feared she had gone too far. But when he spoke, his voice was low and filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "There are reasons," he said, "for the way I am, for the way I rule. Reasons you could not possibly understand." "Then help me understand," Elisabeta said softly, rising from her chair. She took a tentative step towards him. "Your Majesty, Darius, you don't have to carry your burdens alone." The use of his given name seemed to startle him. He turned, eyes wide with surprise, to find Elisabeta standing much closer than before. For a brief moment, the mask of the cold, cruel king slipped, revealing a vulnerability that took her breath away. "You cannot know what you ask," Darius said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The weight of a crown, the loneliness of rule. It is not a burden easily shared." "Perhaps not," Elisabeta agreed, "but sometimes just having someone to listen can make the load a little lighter." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to fall away. Elisabeta felt a strange pull, an inexplicable urge to reach out and touch him, to offer comfort in a more tangible way. The spell was broken by a sharp knock at the door. Darius stepped back, his face once again a mask of regal indifference. "Enter," he called. A young guard burst in, out of breath. "Your Majesty," he panted. "Forgive the interruption, but there's been an incident in the village. A fire." Darius was immediately alert. "How bad?" "Several homes destroyed, sire. The villagers are calling for aid." The king nodded sharply. "Gather the royal guard. We ride at once." As Darius strode towards the door, he paused, glancing back at Elisabeta. "We will continue this discussion another time," he said, his tone softer than she expected. Elisabeta watched him go, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and something dangerously close to hope. As the door closed behind him, she sank back into her chair, her mind whirling with the events of the evening. The king, it seemed, was not the heartless tyrant she had once believed him to be. There were depths to him, hidden pain and vulnerability that he kept carefully guarded. And despite all reason, Elisabeta found herself wanting to know more, to unravel the mystery of the man behind the crown. As she made her way back to her quarters, Elisabeta couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them. The walls Darius had built around himself were beginning to crumble, and she was being drawn inexorably into the heart of a story far greater than she could have imagined. Little did she know, the events set in motion that night would not only change her life, but shake the very foundations of the kingdom itself. In the days that followed, rumors of the king's actions in the village spread like wildfire through the castle. Servants whispered of how he had personally helped extinguish the flames, how he had ordered food and blankets distributed to those left homeless. "It's not like him," Mariana mused one afternoon as she and Elisabeta worked side by side in the laundry. "The king we know would have sent aid, certainly, but to go himself? To work alongside common folk? It's unheard of." Elisabeta said nothing, but she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. She knew, in her heart, that she had witnessed the first cracks in the king's icy facade. The question now was, how much further would those cracks spread? As autumn gave way to winter, Elisabeta found herself looking forward to her evenings with Darius more and more. Though he never again showed the vulnerability he had that night, there was a subtle shift in their interactions. His gaze lingered on her face as she read, and sometimes, when she glanced up, she caught a softness in his eyes that made her heart skip a beat. One snowy evening, as Elisabeta finished reading a particularly moving passage, she looked up to find Darius watching her intently. "You have a gift," he said softly. "The words come alive when you speak them." Elisabeta felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I've always loved stories. They have a way of transporting us, don't they? Of showing us different worlds, different lives." Darius nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "And do you ever wish for a different life, Elisabeta?" he asked, his voice low. "One far from here, perhaps?" The question caught her off guard. She considered her answer carefully. I used to," she admitted. "When I first came here, I dreamed of escape, of returning to my old life. But now—" She met his gaze steadily. "Now I'm not so sure. I feel as though I'm meant to be here, in some strange way." Something flickered in Darius's eyes, hope, longing, but it was gone before she could be sure. "You are an enigma, Elisabeta Ionescu," he said softly. "Just when I think I have you figured out, you surprise me again." As Elisabeta left the study that night, her mind whirling with the implications of their conversation, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the precipice of something momentous. The cruel king was changing, softening in ways she never could have imagined. And her own heart, she realized with a mixture of excitement and fear, was changing too. The winter winds howled outside the castle walls, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. Rumors of the king's changing demeanor spread through the corridors like wildfire, whispered in corners and behind closed doors. Elisabeta found herself at the center of it all, acutely aware of the curious and sometimes hostile glances thrown her way. One frosty morning, as she made her way to the royal scribe's office, Elisabeta overheard two noblewomen gossiping in hushed tones. "Did you see how he looked at her during the Yuletide feast?" the first woman hissed. "It's unnatural, I tell you. A king, besotted with a common servant." "Hush, Ileana," her companion warned. "The walls have ears. But you're right. Something must be done, for the good of the kingdom." Elisabeta hurried past, her cheeks burning with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. She had noticed the king's gaze upon her during the feast, of course. How could she not? But surely they were misinterpreting things. Darius was softer with her, perhaps, but besotted? It seemed impossible. Lost in thought, she nearly collided with a tall figure rounding the corner. Strong hands steadied her, and Elisabeta looked up into the piercing blue eyes of King Darius himself. "Your Majesty," she gasped, dropping into a hasty curtsy. "Forgive me, I wasn't watching where I was going." Darius's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "No harm done," he said, his voice low. "Though I must say, you seem rather distracted this morning. Is something troubling you?" Elisabeta hesitated, unsure how to respond. The king's perceptiveness never ceased to amaze her. It's nothing, Your Majesty. Just idle gossip." Darius's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ah," he said, understanding dawning in his expression. "You've heard the whispers, then?" Yes," Elisabeta admitted, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I never meant to cause any trouble or speculation. To her surprise, Darius let out a soft chuckle. My dear Elisabeta, he said, and the warmth in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. You have nothing to apologize for. The court will always find something to gossip about. Let them talk. Elisabeta looked up, meeting his gaze. But doesn't it bother you, the things they're saying? Darius was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. There was a time, he said slowly, when I would have raged at such insolence, but now... He shook his head, a wry smile playing at his lips. Now I find I care far less about their opinions than I once did. Before Elisabeta could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. Darius stepped back, his face once again assuming its usual mask of regal indifference. Come to my study this evening, he said, his tone businesslike but with an undercurrent of something else. There's a matter I wish to discuss with you. With that, he strode away, leaving Elisabeta standing in the corridor, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The day seemed to drag on interminably. Elisabeta threw herself into her work, assisting Theodore with a stack of trade agreements that required careful transcription. But her mind kept wandering to the evening ahead. What could the king want to discuss? As twilight fell, Elisabeta made her way to Darius's study, her pulse quickening with each step. She knocked softly on the ornate door. Enter, came the king's voice from within. Elisabeta stepped inside, finding Darius seated at his massive desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and ancient tomes. He looked up as she entered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of relief, happiness in his eyes. Ah, Elisabeta, he said, gesturing for her to take a seat across from him. Thank you for coming. Of course, Your Majesty, she replied, settling into the chair. How may I be of service? Darius was silent for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Finally he spoke. I find myself in need of your unique perspective, he said. Elisabeta blinked in surprise. My perspective, sire? Yes, Darius nodded. You see, I've been considering making some changes to the way things are run in the kingdom. Nothing drastic, mind you, but improvements for the common people. Elisabeta's eyes widened. This was unexpected, to say the least. That's wonderful, Your Majesty, she said cautiously. But why ask for my opinion? Surely your advisors would be better suited to such matters. Darius's lips quirked in a wry smile. My advisors, he said, are so entrenched in the old ways that they can scarcely conceive of change. But you, Elisabeta, you see things differently. You've lived among the common folk. You understand their struggles in a way my court never could. Elisabeta felt a warmth bloom in her chest at his words. I'm honored that you value my input, Your Majesty, she said softly. What did you have in mind? For the next hour, Darius outlined his ideas, plans to improve education for the poor, to establish fairer trade practices, to create a system of support for those fallen on hard times. Elisabeta listened in growing amazement, offering suggestions and insights where she could. As their discussion wound down, Darius leaned back in his chair, a look of satisfaction on his face. Thank you, Elisabeta, he said, his voice warm. Your thoughts have been most illuminating. It's my pleasure, Your Majesty, she replied, a smile tugging at her lips. I must say, I'm surprised. These changes, they're so compassionate. Darius's expression softened, a vulnerability creeping into his eyes that took Elisabeta's breath away. Perhaps, he said quietly, I've been reminded recently of what true strength looks like. It's not in ruling through fear, but in caring for one's people. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken emotion. Elisabeta felt her heart racing, aware that they were on the precipice of something momentous. Your Majesty, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. But before she could finish, a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Darius's face immediately closed off. the mask of the stern king slipping back into place. "Enter," he called, his voice once again cold and authoritative. Lord Dragomir burst into the room, his face flushed with agitation. "Your Majesty," he panted, "forgive the interruption, but there's been an incident. A group of nobles, they're demanding an audience. They speak of treason." Darius was on his feet in an instant, all trace of the warm, vulnerable man gone. "Treason," he growled. "Against whom?" Dragomir's eyes flicked nervously to Elisabeta before returning to the king. Against you, sire. They claim you've been bewitched, that your recent actions are a threat to the stability of the realm." Elisabeta felt her blood run cold. This was her fault. The changes in the king, the softening of his demeanor. The court was blaming her for it all. Darius's face was thunderous. "Where are they?" he demanded. "In the Great Hall, Your Majesty. They refuse to leave until you address their concerns." The king nodded sharply. "Very well. I'll deal with this nonsense myself." He turned to Elisabeta, his expression softening for just a moment. "Wait here," he said quietly. "We're not finished with our discussion." As Darius strode from the room, his cloak billowing behind him, Elisabeta sank back into her chair, her mind reeling. What had she done? Her presence, her influence on the king, it was tearing the court apart. For a wild moment she considered fleeing, packing her meager belongings and disappearing into the night, before she could cause any more damage. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew she couldn't do it. Whatever was happening between her and Darius, whatever changes were taking place in the kingdom, she was a part of it now. For better or worse, her fate was tied to this place, to this man. As the minutes ticked by, Elisabeta paced the study, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. What was happening in the Great Hall? Would Darius be able to quell the noble's fears, or had she inadvertently sparked a rebellion? Finally, after what felt like hours, the door opened. Darius entered, his face drawn and weary, but with a fire in his eyes that spoke of barely contained rage. "Your Majesty," Elisabeta breathed, taking an involuntary step towards him. "What happened? Are you all right?" Darius met her gaze, and the intensity she saw there made her heart skip a beat. "The situation has been handled," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But make no mistake, Elisabeta, this is far from over." As she looked into his eyes, Elisabeta realized that everything had changed. The delicate balance they had been maintaining, the slow dance of growing trust and affection, it had all been thrown into chaos. And in that moment, she knew that the true test of their bond was only just beginning. The days following the noble's confrontation were tense, filled with wary glances and hushed whispers. Elisabeta felt the weight of suspicious stares wherever she went, acutely aware that many in the castle blamed her for the king's changing demeanor. She threw herself into her work, hoping to prove her worth through diligence and dedication. One particularly frosty morning, as Elisabeta made her way to the royal scribe's office, she was intercepted by Lady Ileana, one of the noblewomen she had overheard gossiping earlier. "Well, well," Ileana drawled, her voice dripping with disdain. "If it isn't the king's little inspiration?" Elisabeta straightened her spine, meeting the noblewoman's gaze steadily. "Good morning, Lady Ileana. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." Ileana's eyes narrowed. "Oh, I think you do. Don't play coy, girl. We all see how the king looks at you, how he's changed since you arrived. What sort of witchcraft have you worked on him, I wonder?" "I've done nothing of the sort," Elisabeta replied, fighting to keep her voice calm. "His Majesty is a good and just ruler. Any changes he's made have been for the benefit of the kingdom." "The benefit of the kingdom?" Ileana scoffed. "He's weakening, growing soft, and it's all because of you. Mark my words, girl. This won't end well for you. The court won't stand for it." Before Elisabeta could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here, ladies?" Both women turned to see King Darius himself standing at the end of the corridor, his expression unreadable. Ileana immediately dropped into a deep curtsy, her face paling. "Your Majesty, we were just having a friendly chat, no doubt." Darius finished for her, his tone icy. Lady Ileana, I believe your husband was looking for you in the East Wing. Perhaps you should attend to him. Ileana didn't need to be told twice. With a final glare at Elisabeta, she hurried away, leaving the king and the servant girl alone in the corridor. Darius turned his piercing gaze to Elisabeta. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softening slightly. Elisabeta nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. "Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you for your intervention." The king studied her face for a moment, then spoke. "Walk with me," he said, not a request but a command. As they made their way through the winding corridors of the castle, Elisabeta could feel the curious stares of servants and nobles alike. Darius seemed oblivious to the attention, his stride purposeful and his expression thoughtful. Finally, they reached a small, secluded balcony overlooking the snow-covered gardens. Darius closed the door behind them, ensuring their privacy. "Elisabeta," he began, his voice low and intense, "I owe you an apology." She blinked in surprise. "An apology, Your Majesty? Whatever for?" Darius sighed, running a hand through his hair, a surprisingly human gesture that made Elisabeta's heart skip a beat. "For putting you in this position, for exposing you to the court's venom. I should have anticipated their reaction." "It's not your fault, Your Majesty," Elisabeta said softly. "You've done nothing wrong. Your changes to the kingdom, they're good. The people are benefiting." "Perhaps," Darius acknowledged. "But at what cost? The nobles are restless, the court is divided. And you're caught in the middle of it all." Elisabeta took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "May I speak freely, Your Majesty?" Darius's lips quirked in a small smile. "When have you ever not?" She couldn't help but return his smile, feeling some of the tension dissipate. "The changes you're making, they're important. They're necessary. Yes, there's resistance now, but in time people will see the benefits. You're becoming the kind of ruler this kingdom needs. Compassionate, just, willing to listen to all your subjects, not just the nobility." Darius studied her face intently, his eyes softening. "And what of you, Elisabeta? How do you see me?" The question hung in the air between them, fraught with unspoken meaning. Elisabeta felt her heart racing, aware that her answer could change everything. "I see," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "A man, a good man, trying to do what's right. A king who cares for his people, even when it's difficult. And—" she hesitated, then pressed on. "A friend. Someone I've come to care for deeply." Darius's breath caught audibly. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Elisabeta," he murmured, reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from her face. "You've changed everything. You know that, don't you?" She leaned into his touch, her skin tingling where his fingers had grazed her cheek. "As have you, Your Majesty. You've shown me a side of yourself I never expected to see." For a moment they stood there, suspended in time, the air between them charged with possibility. Then, slowly, inexorably, Darius leaned in, his lips mere inches from hers. A sharp knock at the balcony door shattered the moment. Darius stepped back, his face immediately assuming its usual mask of regal indifference. "Enter," he called, his voice steady despite the tumult Elisabeta could see in his eyes. The door opened to reveal Theodore, the royal scribe, looking flustered. "Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty, but there's an urgent matter requiring your attention, a dispute in the village." Darius nodded sharply. "I'll be there momentarily." As Theodore bowed and retreated, the king turned back to Elisabeta. "We'll continue this discussion later," he said softly, his eyes conveying a wealth of unspoken emotion. As Elisabeta watched him stride away, her heart pounding and her mind whirling, she knew that everything had changed. The line between king and servant, between duty and desire, was blurring beyond recognition. And though a part of her thrilled at the possibility, another part trembled with fear at the consequences that might follow. The rest of the day passed in a haze for Elisabeta. She went through her duties mechanically, her mind constantly replaying the moment on the balcony. What would have happened if they hadn't been interrupted? And more importantly, what would happen now? As evening fell, Elisabeta made her way to the king's study for their nightly reading session, her stomach fluttering with nerves. She knocked softly, entering when bidden. Darius was seated by the fire, his expression thoughtful as he gazed into the flames. He looked up as she entered, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Elisabeta," he said, his voice warm. "Come, sit with me." She took her usual seat across from him, acutely aware of the charged atmosphere between them. For a long moment neither spoke, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Finally, Darius broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low and serious, "about what you said earlier, about the changes I'm making and the resistance we're facing." Elisabeta leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "And what have you concluded, Your Majesty?" "That you're right," he said simply. "These changes are necessary no matter how difficult. But I've also realized something else." He paused, his gaze locked on hers. "I can't do it alone." Elisabeta's heart raced at his words. "What are you saying, Your Majesty?" Darius stood, moving to kneel before her chair. He took her hands in his, the gesture so intimate it made her breath hitch. "I'm saying, Elisabeta Ionescu, that I need you, not just as a servant, not just as an advisor, but as a partner, in all things." Elisabeta felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. "Your Majesty," she breathed, Are you asking?" "I'm asking you to stand by my side," Darius said, his voice filled with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "To help me lead this kingdom into a new era, to be my queen." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and fraught with danger. Elisabeta's mind raced with the implications. To be queen. It was beyond anything she had ever dreamed, but the court, the nobles, they would never accept it. "Darius," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. I'm honored, but you know it's impossible. The court would never accept a former servant as their queen." A fire blazed in Darius's eyes. "Let them try to stop us," he growled. "I am the king. If I choose you as my queen, they will accept it or face the consequences." Elisabeta's heart swelled with love and fear in equal measure. "But at what cost?" she asked, her voice trembling. "There could be rebellion, civil war even. I can't be the cause of that." Darius's grip on her hands tightened. "You wouldn't be the cause," he insisted. "You would be the solution. Together we could bring about real change. We could make this kingdom better for everyone, not just the nobility." As Elisabeta looked into his eyes, she saw the truth of his words. This wasn't just about love or desire, though those emotions were certainly present. This was about the future of the kingdom, about the legacy they could build together. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need time to think, Your Majesty. It's more than I ever imagined." Darius nodded, understanding in his eyes. He raised her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "But know this, Elisabeta. Whatever you decide, whatever challenges we face, I will stand by you. Always." As Elisabeta left the study that night, her mind whirling with possibilities and her heart full to bursting, she knew that her life would never be the same. The path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but it was also filled with hope and the promise of a love she had never dared to dream of. Whatever her decision, whatever the future held, one thing was certain. The story of the servant girl and the cruel king was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The days that followed Darius's proposal were a whirlwind of emotion for Elisabeta. She went about her duties in a daze, her mind constantly torn between the incredible opportunity before her and the daunting challenges it presented. The whispers and stares from the court seemed to intensify, as if they could sense the momentous decision hanging in the balance. One crisp morning, as Elisabeta was organizing documents in the royal library, she was surprised by the arrival of Mariana, the kind-hearted servant who had befriended her when she first arrived at the castle. "There you are," Mariana said, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "I've hardly seen you these past few days. Is everything all right?" Elisabeta forced a smile, trying to hide the turmoil in her heart. "Of course, Mariana. I've just been busy." The older woman raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Busy indeed. With the king, perhaps?" Elisabeta's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Mariana sighed, glancing around to ensure they were alone before leaning in close. "My dear, the whole castle is abuzz with rumors. The way the king looks at you, the time you spend together. Some say he's planning to make you his queen." For a moment, Elisabeta considered denying everything. But looking into Mariana's kind eyes, she found she couldn't lie. He's asked me," she admitted in a whisper. "But I haven't given him an answer yet." Mariana's eyes widened in shock. "Oh, my dear girl," she breathed. This is incredible and terrifying." Elisabeta nodded, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "I don't know what to do, Mariana. I care for him deeply, and I believe in the changes he wants to make for the kingdom. But to be queen, I'm just a servant. The nobles will never accept me." Mariana took Elisabeta's hands in hers, her grip warm and comforting. "Listen to me, child. You are so much more than just a servant. I've watched you these past months. You have a strength, a wisdom that many of those puffed-up nobles could only dream of. If anyone can handle the challenges of being queen, it's you." Elisabeta felt a warmth bloom in her chest at Mariana's words. "But what about the danger?" she asked. "There's already talk of rebellion. If I accept, it could tear the kingdom apart." Mariana's expression grew serious. "There's always danger in great change, my dear, but sometimes the risk is worth it. You and the king together, you could do so much good. Don't let fear hold you back from your destiny." As Mariana left, her words echoing in Elisabeta's mind, a new sense of purpose began to take root. Perhaps this was more than just a personal decision. Perhaps it was, as Mariana had said, her destiny. That evening, as Elisabeta made her way to the king's study for their nightly reading session, her heart raced with anticipation. She had made her decision, for better or worse. She knocked softly, entering when bidden. Darius was standing by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered gardens. He turned as she entered, and the look of hope and vulnerability in his eyes nearly took her breath away. "Elisabeta," he said softly, taking a step towards her. "I've missed you these past days." She smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her at his words. "I've missed you too, Your Majesty. I've been thinking about your proposal." Darius's breath caught audibly. "And?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elisabeta took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Before I give you my answer, I need to know something. This isn't just about us, is it? It's about the future of the kingdom." Darius nodded slowly, his expression serious. "You're right. My feelings for you are profound. But this is about more than that. Together we could bring about real change. We could make this kingdom a better place for all its people, not just the nobility. And you truly believe I can help with that?" Elisabeta asked, her voice small. "I'm not educated in matters of state. I don't know the first thing about being a queen." Darius closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "You have something far more valuable than formal education, Elisabeta. You have compassion, wisdom, and a deep understanding of the common people. Those are the qualities this kingdom needs in its queen." Elisabeta looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. Then, "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, I will be your queen." The joy that bloomed on Darius's face was unlike anything Elisabeta had ever seen. For a moment, he looked years younger, the weight of the crown lifting from his shoulders. He pulled her close, one hand cupping her face gently. "My Elisabeta," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You have made me the happiest man in all of Romania." Slowly, tenderly, he leaned in, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that spoke of promise, of hope, of a future brighter than either of them had dared to dream. As they broke apart, both breathless and flushed, reality began to seep back in. "What happens now?" Elisabeta asked, her mind already racing with the challenges ahead. Darius's expression grew serious, though his eyes still shone with happiness. "Now, we prepare. The announcement will cause an uproar, no doubt. We must be ready to face the opposition head-on." Elisabeta nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "How do we begin?" "First," Darius said, a hint of mischief in his smile, "we give the court something to really gossip about." The next morning, as the nobles gathered in the great hall for the daily audience, whispers of speculation filled the air. King Darius had summoned them all, promising an announcement of great importance. As the massive doors swung open, a hush fell over the crowd. King Darius strode in, his head held high and his eyes blazing with determination. But it was the figure at his side that caused gasps of shock to ripple through the assembly. Elisabeta walked beside the king, her hand resting in the crook of his arm. She wore a gown of deep burgundy, far finer than anything she had ever owned, with her hair adorned with delicate golden pins. Though her heart raced with nerves, she kept her chin up, meeting the stunned gazes of the nobles with quiet dignity. As they reached the dais, Darius turned to face the crowd, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "My loyal subjects," he began, "I have gathered you here today to share joyous news. I am to be married." A murmur of excitement ran through the crowd, quickly followed by confusion as they realized the implications. "Allow me to present my chosen bride," Darius continued, his grip on Elisabeta's hand tightening reassuringly. "Lady Elisabeta Ionescu, soon to be your queen." The great hall erupted into chaos. Shouts of outrage mingled with gasps of disbelief. Lady Ileana, her face red with fury, pushed to the front of the crowd. "This is an outrage," she cried. "You cannot make a common servant our queen. It goes against all tradition, all propriety." Darius's eyes flashed dangerously. "I am your king," he said, his voice low but carrying easily over the din. "My word is law. Lady Elisabeta has proven herself to be wise, compassionate, and devoted to the welfare of this kingdom. She will make an excellent queen, and you will show her the respect she deserves." Lord Dragomir stepped forward, his expression a mixture of concern and calculation. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "while we of course wish you every happiness, perhaps it would be wise to consider the implications of such a match. The other kingdoms may view it as a sign of weakness." Elisabeta felt a flare of indignation at his words. Before Darius could respond, she found herself speaking, her voice clear and steady. "My lords and ladies," she said, meeting their gazes one by one, "I understand your concerns. I know that I am not what you expected or hoped for in a queen, but I assure you, my devotion to this kingdom and its people is absolute. I may not have been born to nobility, but I will work tirelessly to prove myself worthy of the trust His Majesty has placed in me." A hush fell over the crowd as they listened to her words. Elisabeta could see the surprise in their eyes, perhaps hearing eloquence where they had expected only a servant's stammering. Darius squeezed her hand, pride evident in his expression. "Well said, my love," he murmured, before addressing the court once more. "Let it be known that any who oppose this union or seek to undermine my queen will be dealt with severely. But to those who embrace this change, who work with us to build a brighter future for all of Romania, you will find no greater allies than Elisabeta and myself." As the nobles began to disperse, their expressions ranging from thoughtful to outright hostile, Elisabeta felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror. The die was cast. There was no going back now. Darius turned to her, his eyes soft with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Elisabeta nodded, managing a small smile. "I'm scared," she admitted. "But I'm ready. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Darius raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Together," he agreed. "Always." As they left the great hall, hand in hand, Elisabeta knew that the real challenges were only just beginning. but with Darius by her side, and the hope of a better future for Romania burning bright in her heart, she felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. The story of the servant girl and the once cruel king was far from over. In fact, it was about to enter its most thrilling chapter yet. The weeks following the announcement of Elisabeta and Darius's engagement were a whirlwind of activity. The castle buzzed with preparations for the royal wedding, while whispers of discontent continued to circulate among certain factions of the nobility. Elisabeta found herself thrust into a world of protocol and etiquette lessons, struggling to navigate the complex web of court politics. One particularly trying afternoon, Elisabeta sat in the royal solar, surrounded by a bevy of noble ladies who had been assigned to assist in her transformation into a suitable queen. Lady Ileana, much to Elisabeta's dismay, had been appointed to lead this effort. No, 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 Ileana sighed, her voice dripping with poorly concealed disdain. You must hold your teacup like this. She demonstrated with exaggerated grace. Really, it's not that difficult. Elisabeta bit back a retort, reminding herself that she needed to win these women over, not antagonize them further. Thank you, Lady Ileana, she said, forcing a smile. I appreciate your guidance. Ileana's eyes narrowed suspiciously, clearly expecting more resistance. Yes, well, she sniffed. There's still so much for you to learn, a lifetime of common habits to overcome. Before Elisabeta could respond, the door to the solar burst open, revealing a flustered-looking Mariana. Begging your pardon, my ladies, she said, bobbing a quick curtsy, but His Majesty requests Lady Elisabeta's presence immediately. Ileana's lips pursed in disapproval, but she could hardly refuse a royal summons. Very well, she said coolly. We'll continue this lesson tomorrow. As Elisabeta followed Mariana from the room, she let out a sigh of relief. Thank you, she murmured. I'm not sure how much more of that I could have taken. Mariana's eyes twinkled with mischief. Who says I was rescuing you? She teased. His Majesty really did send for you, though I may have emphasized the urgency of the matter. Elisabeta laughed, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. You're a true friend, Mariana. I don't know what I'd do without you. They arrived at Darius's study, and Mariana gave Elisabeta's hand a quick, encouraging squeeze before departing. Elisabeta knocked softly, entering when bidden. She found Darius pacing before the fireplace, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, his expression immediately softening. Elisabeta, he said warmly, crossing the room to take her hands in his. How are you, my love? How go the lessons? Elisabeta sighed, leaning into his embrace. They're challenging, she admitted. Lady Ileana seems determined to find fault with everything I do. Darius's eyes flashed with anger. I can have her removed from your service, he offered. You shouldn't have to endure such treatment. But Elisabeta shook her head. No, that would only make things worse. I need to win them over, not alienate them further. She managed a wry smile. Besides, I'm learning a great deal about patience and diplomacy. Darius chuckled, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. My wise queen, he murmured. You continue to amaze me. They settled into chairs by the fire, and Darius's expression grew serious once more. I'm afraid I didn't summon you here solely for the pleasure of your company, he said. There's a matter we need to discuss. Elisabeta sat up straighter, her heart quickening. What is it? Darius sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've received word from our spies. It seems a group of disgruntled nobles are plotting against us. They aim to prevent our marriage and restore what they call the proper order of things. Elisabeta felt a chill run down her spine. What are they planning? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nothing concrete yet, Darius assured her. But there's talk of rallying support from neighboring kingdoms, of challenging my fitness to rule. Some even whisper of more direct methods. Assassination, Elisabeta breathed, her face paling. Darius nodded grimly. It's a possibility we must consider, which is why I've decided to accelerate our plans. We'll be married within the fortnight, before they have a chance to gather more support. Elisabeta's mind whirled with the implications. So soon? But the preparations. To hell with the preparations, Darius said fiercely. All that matters is that we're united, officially and irrevocably. Once you're crowned queen, it will be much harder for them to challenge your position. Elisabeta nodded slowly, seeing the wisdom in his plan, but a small part of her couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. I always dreamed of a beautiful wedding, she admitted softly. Silly, I know, given the circumstances. Darius's expression softened, and he knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. My love, he said earnestly, if I could, I would give you a wedding to rival any in history. But know this, whether we marry in the grandest cathedral or the humblest chapel, it will be beautiful because we'll be joining our lives together. That's all that truly matters. Tears pricked at Elisabeta's eyes, and she leaned forward to press a tender kiss to Darius's lips. You're right, of course, she murmured. As long as we're together, nothing else matters. They spent the next hour discussing the details of their hastened plans, working out how to announce the change to the court and the necessary security measures. As they talked, Elisabeta felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination. This was about more than just their love. It was about the future of the kingdom, about bringing positive change to the lives of all Romanians. As evening fell, a knock at the study door interrupted their planning. Theodore, the royal scribe, entered, looking flustered. Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty, he said, bowing deeply. But there's been an incident in the village. A group of peasants, they're at the gates demanding to speak with you. Darius frowned, rising to his feet. What do they want? Theodore hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to Elisabeta. They say they've come to support Lady Elisabeta. Word of your engagement has spread, it seems, and the common folk, they're overjoyed at the idea of one of their own becoming queen. Elisabeta's eyes widened in surprise. She had been so focused on the opposition from the nobility that she hadn't considered how the news might be received by the common people. Darius turned to her, a slow smile spreading across his face. It seems, my love, that you already have more support than we realized. Shall we go and greet your admirers? Elisabeta nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. As they made their way to the castle gates, she could hear the growing roar of the crowd outside. When the gates swung open, revealing hundreds of peasants bearing flowers and crude banners, Elisabeta felt tears spring to her eyes. A weathered old woman pushed to the front of the crowd, presenting Elisabeta with a bouquet of wildflowers. Bless you, my lady, she said, her voice quavering with emotion. You'll be a queen for all of us, not just the rich folk. Elisabeta accepted the flowers, deeply moved. Thank you, she said, her voice carrying over the hushed crowd. I promise to do everything in my power to be worthy of your trust and support. As she and Darius addressed the gathering, reassuring them of their commitment to improving the lives of all Romanians, Elisabeta felt a surge of confidence. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with danger and opposition. But with the love of Darius and the support of the common people, she knew they could overcome any obstacle. Later that night, as Elisabeta prepared for bed in her new royal chambers, a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Darius standing there, a tender expression on his face. I couldn't sleep, he admitted, stepping into the room. I kept thinking about today, about the people's reaction to you. Elisabeta, do you realize what a gift you are to this kingdom? Elisabeta blushed, ducking her head. I'm just trying to do what's right, she murmured. Darius tilted her chin up, meeting her gaze. You're so much more than that, he said softly. You're hope, Elisabeta. Hope for a better future, for a kingdom where everyone has a voice. I love you not just for who you are, but for who you're helping me become. Overwhelmed by emotion, Elisabeta pulled Darius close, capturing his lips in a passionate kiss. As they broke apart, both breathless, she whispered, I love you too, more than I ever thought possible. As Darius reluctantly bid her good night, promising to see her in the morning to continue their wedding preparations, Elisabeta felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever plots their enemies might hatch, she knew that their love, and the love of the people, would see them through. The once feared King Darius and the former servant girl Elisabeta were on the cusp of a new chapter, not just in their own lives, but in the history of Romania itself. And as Elisabeta drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of the bright future they would build together, hand in hand, united in love and purpose. The dawn of the royal wedding day broke crisp and clear, the sun casting a golden glow over the frost-covered grounds of the castle. Elisabeta stood at her chamber window, watching as the first rays of light touched the spires and turrets, transforming the imposing stone structure into something almost magical. A soft knock at the door roused her from her reverie. "Come in," she called, turning to see Mariana enter, her arms laden with fabrics and flowers. "It's time, my lady," Mariana said, her eyes shining with excitement and unshed tears. "Let's make you a queen." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Elisabeta was bathed in scented oils, her hair intricately braided and adorned with pearls and white blossoms. The wedding gown, a creation of ivory silk and delicate lace, was carefully fitted to her form. As Mariana made the final adjustments to the gown, Elisabeta caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror. For a moment, she hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. Gone was the simple servant girl. In her place stood a regal figure, every inch a queen. "Oh, my dear," Mariana breathed, coming to stand beside her. "You look absolutely radiant." Elisabeta felt tears prick at her eyes. "I can hardly believe this is real," she confessed. "Just months ago, I was sold to the castle to pay my family's debts. And now—" Mariana squeezed her hand gently. "And now you're about to become the greatest queen Romania has ever known," she said firmly. "You've earned this, Elisabeta, not just through your love for the king, but through your compassion, your wisdom, and your dedication to the people." Before Elisabeta could respond, another knock sounded at the door. This time it was Lady Ileana who entered, her expression a mixture of resignation and grudging respect. "It's time," she announced. "The king awaits you in the great hall." As they made their way through the winding corridors of the castle, Elisabeta's heart raced with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The whispers of plots against them still echoed in her mind, and she couldn't help but wonder if their enemies would choose this day to strike. At the doors to the great hall they paused. Lady Ileana turned to Elisabeta, her expression softening slightly. I may have misjudged you," she said stiffly. "Perhaps you will make a fine queen after all." Elisabeta blinked in surprise at the unexpected admission. "Thank you, Lady Ileana," she said softly. "I hope we can work together for the good of the kingdom." Ileana nodded sharply, then gestured to the guards. "Open the doors," she commanded. As the massive oak doors swung open, revealing the great hall packed with nobles, foreign dignitaries, and commoners alike, a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to Elisabeta as she began her slow procession down the aisle. At the far end of the hall, standing before the ornate throne, was Darius. His eyes locked on Elisabeta, filled with such love and wonder that it took her breath away. As she reached him, he extended his hand, helping her up the steps to stand beside him. "My love," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You are more beautiful than I could have ever imagined." The ceremony itself was a blur of ancient vows and sacred rituals. Elisabeta and Darius exchanged rings, golden bands that glinted in the light streaming through the stained glass windows. As the high priest pronounced them husband and wife, king and queen of Romania, the hall erupted in cheers. Darius pulled Elisabeta close, capturing her lips in a kiss that spoke of love, promise, and a future brighter than either of them had ever dared to dream. As they broke apart, both breathless and flushed, Elisabeta couldn't help but smile at the joy radiating from her husband's face. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Elisabeta had ever experienced. The great hall was transformed into a sea of color and music, with nobles and commoners alike joining in the festivities. As she and Darius made their way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes, Elisabeta was struck by the genuine warmth in many of the greetings. "It seems our union has more support than we realized," Darius murmured in her ear as they paused for a moment at the edge of the hall. Elisabeta nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd. But we must remain vigilant, she reminded him. Not everyone is happy with this change. As if summoned by her words, Lord Dragomir approached, his expression carefully neutral. Your Majesties, he said, bowing low. My congratulations on your union. Thank you, Lord Dragomir, Darius replied, his tone cordial but guarded. I trust you'll join us in working towards a brighter future for Romania. Dragomir's eyes flicked to Elisabeta before returning to the king. Of course, Your Majesty. We all want what's best for the kingdom. As he moved away, Elisabeta couldn't shake the feeling that his words held a hidden meaning. She leaned closer to Darius, keeping her voice low. We should keep a close eye on him, she murmured. I fear he may be involved in the plots against us. Darius nodded, his expression grim. Agreed. But for now, let's not let such concerns overshadow our happiness. This is our day, my love. As the celebration continued into the night, Elisabeta found herself drawn into conversation after conversation. Noble ladies who had once looked down their noses at her now sought her opinion on matters of state. Foreign ambassadors paid their respects, their eyes appraising as they took the measure of Romania's new queen. It was nearing midnight when Darius finally managed to steal her away for a moment alone. They slipped out onto a secluded balcony, the cool night air a welcome respite from the warmth of the crowded hall. How are you feeling, my queen? Darius asked, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her close. Elisabeta leaned into his embrace, resting her head on his chest. Overwhelmed, she admitted. Happy beyond measure, but it's all so much. I keep waiting to wake up and find this has all been a dream. Darius chuckled softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I assure you, it's very real, though I sometimes find it hard to believe myself. He paused, his tone growing more serious. Elisabeta, I want you to know, whatever challenges we face, whatever opposition we encounter, I will always stand by your side. You are my partner in all things, my equal in every way. Elisabeta tilted her head up to meet his gaze, her heart swelling with love. And you are mine, she said softly. Together we'll build the kingdom we've dreamed of. A place of justice, compassion, and opportunity for all. Their lips met in a tender kiss, sealing their vows not just as husband and wife, but as rulers committed to a shared vision of a better Romania. As they reluctantly returned to the celebration, Elisabeta caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. It was the old woman who had presented her with wildflowers on the day of their engagement announcement. The woman beamed at her, raising her glass in a silent toast. Elisabeta felt a surge of determination. This was why they were doing this. For people like her, for all the citizens of Romania who had for too long been overlooked and undervalued. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever plots their enemies might hatch, she and Darius would face them together, united in love and purpose. As the night wore on and the festivities began to wind down, Elisabeta found herself growing weary. The events of the day, the weight of her new responsibilities, and the constant vigilance against potential threats had taken their toll. Darius, ever attuned to her needs, noticed her fatigue. Perhaps it's time we retired, my love, he suggested quietly. We have a lifetime ahead of us to celebrate. Elisabeta nodded gratefully, allowing him to make their excuses to the remaining guests. As they made their way to their new shared chambers, she couldn't help but feel a flutter of nervous anticipation in her stomach. This was the beginning of their life together, not just as rulers, but as husband and wife. Once inside their rooms, Darius dismissed the attendants with a wave of his hand. As the door closed behind them, leaving them truly alone for the first time since their vows, he turned to Elisabeta with a tender expression. My queen, he murmured, reaching out to caress her cheek. My love, my partner in all things. Elisabeta leaned into his touch, her eyes shining with emotion. My king, she replied softly. My heart, my home. As they came together in a passionate embrace, all thoughts of politics, plots, and royal responsibilities faded away. In that moment, they were simply Elisabeta and Darius, two souls joined in love, ready to face whatever the future might hold. Later, as they lay entwined in the soft darkness of their chamber, Elisabeta felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead would be challenging, she knew. There would be opposition to overcome, reforms to implement, and a kingdom to unite. But with Darius by her side, she felt ready to face anything. "What are you thinking?" Darius asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her skin. Elisabeta smiled, snuggling closer to him. "I'm thinking about tomorrow," she said. "About all the work we have to do, all the changes we want to make." Darius pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "And are you afraid?" She considered the question for a moment before answering. "No," she said finally. "I'm excited, determined. We have the chance to do so much good, Darius, to make a real difference in people's lives." He pulled her closer, his voice filled with pride and love. "We will, my darling. Together, we'll build a legacy that will last for generations." As Elisabeta drifted off to sleep, safe in the arms of her husband and king, she dreamed of the future they would create. A future of justice, compassion, and hope for all of Romania. The story of the servant girl and the once cruel king had evolved into something far greater. A tale of two leaders, united in love and purpose, ready to change the world. The weeks following the royal wedding were a whirlwind of activity as Elisabeta settled into her new role as Queen of Romania. Each day brought new challenges and responsibilities, but she faced them with determination and grace, drawing strength from Darius's unwavering support and the growing affection of the common people. One crisp autumn morning, Elisabeta sat in the royal study, poring over reports of crop yields and trade negotiations. Darius entered, a concerned expression on his face. "My love," he said, crossing the room to place a gentle kiss on her forehead. "You've been at this for hours. Perhaps it's time for a break." Elisabeta sighed, leaning back in her chair. "There's so much to do, Darius. So many people counting on us. I feel like I'm barely scratching the surface." Darius pulled up a chair beside her, taking her hand in his. "I know, my dear, but you mustn't exhaust yourself. Remember, we're in this together." She managed a small smile, squeezing his hand. "You're right, of course. It's just, I want to prove myself worthy of this position, to show everyone that a former servant can be a good queen." "You have nothing to prove," Darius said firmly. "Your actions speak louder than any noble lineage ever could. The people adore you, Elisabeta, and those who don't, well, they'll come around in time." Before Elisabeta could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Theodore, the royal scribe, entered, his face pale with worry. "Your Majesties," he said, bowing low. "Forgive the interruption, but there's been an incident in the village." Darius straightened, instantly alert. "What sort of incident?" Theodore wrung his hands nervously. "It seems a group of nobles have been stirring up trouble among the peasants. They're spreading rumors that the Queen's reforms are causing food shortages and higher taxes. There's talk of rebellion." Elisabeta felt her heart sink. She had known there would be opposition to their changes, but she hadn't expected it to come so soon or spread so quickly. "We must address this immediately," she said, rising to her feet. "Darius, perhaps we should ride out to the village ourselves, show the people that we're listening to their concerns." Darius nodded, a proud smile tugging at his lips. "An excellent idea, my love. Theodore, have our horses prepared. We'll leave within the hour." As they rode through the countryside, Elisabeta couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of the Romanian autumn. The trees were aflame with reds and golds, the air crisp and fragrant with the scent of ripe apples. It was a stark contrast to the tension they could feel building as they approached the village. A crowd had gathered in the town square, their faces a mix of anger, fear, and confusion. At the center stood Lord Dragomir, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "And so you see, good people, how these so-called reforms are nothing but a ploy to line the pockets of the crown while you suffer," he proclaimed, his face flushed with righteous indignation. As Darius and Elisabeta dismounted, a hush fell over the gathering. Dragomir's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly recovered, offering a deep bow. "Your Majesties," he said, his tone oily, "what an unexpected pleasure." Darius's eyes flashed with anger, but Elisabeta laid a gentle hand on his arm. "Allow me," she murmured, before stepping forward to address the crowd. "My dear friends," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I understand you have concerns about the changes we're implementing in the kingdom. I assure you every decision we make is with your well-being in mind, but perhaps we've been remiss in not explaining our plans more clearly." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the gathered faces. "I was once one of you," she continued. "I know the struggles you face, the fears that keep you awake at night. That's why we're working to create a fairer system, one that provides opportunities for all, not just the privileged few." A murmur ran through the crowd. Elisabeta could see confusion and hope warring on many faces. An old farmer near the front spoke up, his voice quavering. "But, milady, begging your pardon, but Lord Dragomir says the new taxes will ruin us, that we'll lose our farms." Elisabeta's heart ached at the fear in his voice. She stepped closer, her expression earnest. "What is your name, good sir?" "Mihai, your majesty," he replied, ducking his head. "Mihai," Elisabeta said warmly, "I want you to listen carefully. The reforms we're implementing will actually lower taxes for small farmers like yourself. The burden will fall more heavily on large landowners and merchants who can afford to pay more. No one will lose their farm because of our policies. In fact, we're establishing programs to help struggling farmers improve their yields and expand their operations." She turned, her gaze finding Lord Dragomir. "It seems there has been some misinformation spread about our intentions. I wonder, Lord Dragomir, how such lies could have taken root." Dragomir sputtered, his face reddening. I merely reported what I had heard, your majesty. If I was mistaken..." "Mistaken?" Darius's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Or deliberately misleading? I think it's time we had a long discussion about your role in this kingdom, my lord." As the crowd began to disperse, many now wearing expressions of relief and cautious optimism, Elisabeta felt a tug on her sleeve. She turned to find a young girl, no more than 10 years old, looking up at her with wide eyes. "Is it true, your majesty?" the girl asked hesitantly. "That you used to be a servant like us?" Elisabeta knelt down, bringing herself to the child's level. "It is indeed, little one. And do you know what that means?" The girl shook her head, curiosity shining in her eyes. "It means," Elisabeta said softly, "that anything is possible. That no matter where you come from, you can achieve great things if you work hard and believe in yourself." As they rode back to the castle that evening, Elisabeta felt a renewed sense of purpose. The day's events had shown her both the challenges they faced and the profound impact their reforms could have on people's lives. "You were magnificent today," Darius said, his voice filled with pride and love. "The way you connected with the people, how you addressed their fears. You truly are a queen, Elisabeta, in every way that matters." She smiled, warmth blooming in her chest at his words. "We did it together," she reminded him, "as we'll face every challenge that comes our way." Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Darius grew pensive. "We've made progress," he said, "but Dragomir's actions today prove that the threat against us is far from over. We must remain vigilant." Elisabeta nodded, her expression serious. "I agree. But we can't let fear rule us, Darius. We must continue to push forward with our reforms, to show the people that we're committed to creating a better Romania for all." Darius pulled her close, pressing a tender kiss to her lips. "My wise queen," he murmured. "What would I do without you?" As they drifted off to sleep, Elisabeta's mind whirled with plans and possibilities. The road ahead would be challenging, she knew, but with Darius by her side and the support of the people, she felt ready to face whatever came their way. The once feared King Darius and the former servant girl Elisabeta were truly becoming the rulers Romania needed. Compassionate, just, and dedicated to the welfare of all their subjects. And though dangers still lurked in the shadows, their love for each other and for their kingdom burned brighter than ever, a beacon of hope in uncertain times. The crisp autumn air had given way to the first biting chill of winter as Elisabeta stood on the balcony of the royal chambers, her eyes scanning the snow-dusted grounds of the castle. The past few months had been a whirlwind of activity, filled with triumphs and setbacks as she and Darius worked tirelessly to implement their reforms. A warm hand on her shoulder pulled her from her reverie. "You'll catch your death out here, my love," Darius said softly, draping a thick fur cloak around her shoulders. Elisabeta leaned into his embrace, grateful for his warmth and steady presence. "I was just thinking about how much has changed," she mused. "A year ago, I never could have imagined this life." Darius pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. "The life you left behind?" She turned to face him, cupping his cheek in her hand. "Never," she said firmly. "Being with you, working to make Romania a better place for all its people. It's more than I ever dared to dream." Their moment of intimacy was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Theodore entered, his face pale with worry. "Your Majesties," he said, bowing low. "I apologize for the intrusion, but there's been a development." Darius straightened, instantly alert. "What is it, Theodore?" The royal scribe wrung his hands nervously. "We've intercepted a message, Your Majesty. It seems Lord Dragomir has been in secret communication with the neighboring kingdom of Bulgaria. He's offering them military support if they'll help overthrow you and Queen Elisabeta." Elisabeta felt her blood run cold. They had known Dragomir was a threat, but this was beyond anything they had anticipated. "How reliable is this information?" she asked, her mind already racing with potential strategies. "Very, I'm afraid," Theodore replied. "The message was encrypted, but our best code breakers were able to decipher it. There's no doubt of its authenticity." Darius's face hardened, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and determination. "Summon the royal guard," he commanded. "We'll arrest Dragomir immediately." "Wait," Elisabeta said, laying a hand on his arm. "If we move too quickly, we may lose the opportunity to uncover the full extent of this plot. Who else might be involved? How deep does this conspiracy run?" Darius paused, considering her words. "You're right, as always, my love," he said with a small smile. "What do you propose?" Elisabeta's mind whirred with possibilities. "We need to draw them out," she said slowly. "Make them think their plan is working. If we can get Dragomir to reveal his co-conspirators—" "It's risky," Darius warned. "If word gets out that we're vulnerable, it could incite further rebellion." "Then we'll have to be very careful," Elisabeta replied, her eyes gleaming with determination. Theodore spread a rumor among the servants. Nothing too obvious, just whispers that the king and queen are falling ill. That should get Dragomir and his allies moving. As Theodore hurried off to set their plan in motion, Darius pulled Elisabeta close. "You never cease to amaze me," he murmured. "Your mind is as sharp as any general's." She smiled up at him, though her eyes remained serious. "We're fighting for our kingdom, Darius. For the future we believe in. I'll do whatever it takes to protect that." Over the next few days, Elisabeta and Darius put on a carefully choreographed performance. They appeared at public functions looking pale and drawn, leaning on each other for support. Whispers spread through the castle and beyond. The king and queen were gravely ill, perhaps even on their deathbeds. As they had hoped, the bait proved irresistible to their enemies. Late one night, as Elisabeta sat in the dimly lit study poring over intelligence reports, a soft knock sounded at the door. "Enter," she called, her hand instinctively moving to the small dagger concealed in the folds of her gown. To her surprise, it was Mariana who slipped into the room, her face etched with worry. "My lady," she whispered urgently, "I've overheard something terrible." Elisabeta leaned forward, her heart racing. "Tell me everything, Mariana." The older woman wrung her hands nervously. "I was cleaning near Lord Dragomir's chambers when I heard voices. He was meeting with several other nobles, Lord Valeriu, Lady Ileana, and others I didn't recognize. They were planning to poison you and the king at tomorrow night's banquet." Elisabeta felt a chill run down her spine. They had expected Dragomir to make a move, but not so soon, and not so boldly. "You're certain of this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mariana nodded emphatically. I swear it on my life, your majesty. They spoke of a colorless, odorless poison to be slipped into your wine. They planned to blame it on a kitchen servant, claiming it was revenge for the new tax laws. Elisabeta's mind raced with the implications. This was the evidence they needed to bring down Dragomir and his co-conspirators, but acting too soon could spoil everything. They needed to catch them in the act. "Thank you, Mariana," she said, squeezing the woman's hand gratefully. "You've done a great service to the crown. Now I need you to do one more thing for me." As Mariana hurried off to carry out her instructions, Elisabeta made her way to Darius's private chambers. She found him pacing by the fire, his brow furrowed with worry. "Elisabeta," he breathed, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I was beginning to worry. What news?" She quickly relayed what Mariana had overheard, watching as Darius's expression darkened with each word. When she finished, he let out a low growl of anger. "We should arrest them now," he said, his voice tight with fury, "before they have a chance to carry out this plot." Elisabeta shook her head. "No, my love. This is our chance to catch them red-handed, to expose their treachery in a way that leaves no room for doubt." Darius's eyes widened as he realized what she was suggesting. "You want to go through with the banquet? To put ourselves at risk?" "It's the only way," Elisabeta insisted. "We'll take precautions, of course. I've already sent Mariana to alert our most trusted guards. They'll be watching every move Dragomir and his allies make." For a long moment, Darius was silent, studying her face intently. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "You're right, of course," he said. "But I don't like putting you in danger." Elisabeta cupped his face in her hands, her eyes shining with determination and love. "We're in this together, remember? Whatever comes, we face it side by side." As they finalized their plans for the next evening, Elisabeta felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration coursing through her veins. This was it, the moment that would determine the future of their reign and of Romania itself. The night of the banquet arrived, the great hall ablaze with torchlight and the murmur of conversation. Elisabeta sat beside Darius at the high table, her eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of suspicious activity. Lord Dragomir and his known associates were scattered throughout the room, their faces masks of false concern as they inquired after the royal couple's health. As the first course was served, Elisabeta felt her heart racing. She knew that somewhere in the hall, their enemies were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She and Darius had taken every precaution. Their wine had been secretly replaced with colored water, and their most loyal guards were positioned strategically around the room. Midway through the meal, as Darius raised his goblet for a toast, Elisabeta saw a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye. Lord Valeriu, seated just 2 places down, was reaching for something concealed in his sleeve. Time seemed to slow as Elisabeta realized this was the moment they had been waiting for. With a deliberate motion, she knocked over her own goblet, sending the harmless liquid spilling across the table. "Oh, how clumsy of me!" she exclaimed loud enough to draw attention. As servants rushed forward to clean up the spill, Elisabeta locked eyes with the captain of the guard, giving an almost imperceptible nod. In an instant, the hall erupted into chaos. Guards swarmed towards Lord Valeriu, Lord Dragomir, and their co-conspirators. Shouts of surprise and outrage filled the air as the traitors were seized. Darius rose to his feet, his voice cutting through the din like a blade. "Lords and ladies of the court," he thundered, "you witness now the exposure of a plot most foul. These men and women, whom we counted among our trusted advisers, sought to poison your king and queen." As the accused were led away in chains, Elisabeta addressed the stunned gathering. "Let this be a lesson to all who would threaten the peace and prosperity of Romania," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "We will not be cowed by those who cling to the old ways of corruption and self-interest. Together, we will build a kingdom of justice and opportunity for all." Later that night, as Elisabeta and Darius retired to their chambers, the full weight of what they had accomplished began to sink in. "We did it," Elisabeta breathed, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "We've rooted out the traitors." Darius sat beside her, pulling her close. "Thanks to your brilliant plan, my love. You've saved not just our lives, but the future of our kingdom." As they held each other, both exhausted and exhilarated by the night's events, Elisabeta felt a surge of hope for the future. They had faced their greatest threat and emerged victorious. Now, at last, they could move forward with their vision for a better Romania. "What comes next?" she asked softly, looking up into Darius's eyes. He smiled, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead. "We build, my love. We create the kingdom we've dreamed of. Together." As they drifted off to sleep, Elisabeta's mind was filled with visions of the future, of schools and hospitals rising across the land, of prosperous farms and thriving villages. The road ahead would still have its challenges, she knew, but with Darius by her side and the support of their people, she felt ready to face anything. The once cruel king and the former servant girl had become the saviors of Romania, their love and dedication forging a new path for the kingdom. And as the first light of dawn broke over the castle walls, it seemed to herald the beginning of a new era, one of hope, justice, and prosperity for all. The winter months following the foiled assassination attempt passed in a flurry of activity. With the threat of internal rebellion quelled, Elisabeta and Darius threw themselves into implementing their vision for a new Romania. The castle buzzed with energy as plans were drawn up for new schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects across the kingdom. One crisp morning in early spring, Elisabeta stood in the newly established royal library, surrounded by stacks of books and scrolls. She had made it her personal mission to expand access to education throughout Romania, starting with this grand collection of knowledge open to all citizens. As she ran her fingers along the spines of ancient tomes, a soft knock at the door drew her attention. Mariana entered, a warm smile on her face. "Your Majesty," she said, curtsying. "The delegation from the village of Sinaia has arrived. They're waiting in the great hall." Elisabeta nodded, straightening her gown. "Thank you, Mariana. I'll be there shortly." As she made her way through the castle corridors, Elisabeta couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in such a short time. The air of fear and suspicion that had once permeated these halls had been replaced by a sense of purpose and hope. She entered the great hall to find a group of villagers, their faces a mixture of awe and nervousness as they took in their opulent surroundings. At their head stood a tall, weathered man with kind eyes, the village elder, Elisabeta presumed. "Welcome to the castle," she said warmly, approaching the group. "I'm Queen Elisabeta. I understand you've come to discuss the new school we're planning for your village." The elder bowed deeply. "Yes, Your Majesty. I'm Nikolai, and we're deeply honored by your attention to our humble community. But—" He hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. Elisabeta smiled encouragingly. "Please, speak freely. We can only address your concerns if we know what they are." Nikolai nodded, squaring his shoulders. "It's just, some in the village worry that this new school will take children away from the fields and workshops where they're needed, and others fear it's just a way for the crown to exert more control over our lives." Instead of being offended, Elisabeta felt a surge of admiration for the man's honesty. "I understand your concerns, Nikolai. Change can be frightening, especially when it affects the very fabric of your community. But let me ask you this. What future do you envision for your children and grandchildren?" The villagers exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. A young woman, barely more than a girl herself, spoke up hesitantly. I dream of my daughter becoming a healer, Your Majesty. But without proper schooling, it seems impossible." Elisabeta's eyes lit up. "What's your name, dear?" "Maria, Your Majesty," the young woman replied, ducking her head shyly. "Well, Maria, that's exactly the kind of dream we want to make possible," Elisabeta said earnestly. "This school isn't about taking children away from their families or controlling your lives. It's about giving every child in Romania the chance to reach their full potential, whether that's as a farmer, a craftsman, a healer, or even a scholar." She turned back to Nikolai. "As for the practical concerns, we've thought of that too. The school will operate on a schedule that allows children to still help in the fields during planting and harvest times. And for families who rely on their children's labor, we're establishing a stipend system to offset any lost income." The villagers' expressions began to shift from skepticism to cautious hope. Nikolai stroked his beard thoughtfully. "You've given this a great deal of consideration, Your Majesty." Elisabeta nodded. "Of course. These reforms aren't just abstract ideas to me. I grew up in a village not unlike yours. I know the challenges you face, the fears that keep you awake at night. That's why it's so important to me, to us, that we get this right." As the discussion continued, delving into the specifics of the school's curriculum and construction, Elisabeta felt a presence at her side. She turned to see Darius, who had slipped into the hall unnoticed. "You're doing wonderfully, my love," he murmured, his eyes shining with pride. Elisabeta squeezed his hand gratefully. "We're doing this together," she reminded him. "Your support makes all of this possible." As the meeting drew to a close, Nikolai approached the royal couple once more. "Your Majesties," he said, bowing low. "I must confess, I came here today with many doubts, but you've shown us a vision of the future that fills me with hope. On behalf of Sinai, we accept your offer and look forward to the day our new school opens its doors." Elisabeta felt a surge of emotion, tears pricking at her eyes. "Thank you, Nikolai. Your trust means everything to us. Together, we'll build a brighter future for all of Romania." As the villagers filed out, chattering excitedly among themselves, Darius pulled Elisabeta close. "You were magnificent," he said softly. "The way you connected with them, addressed their fears. You truly are the queen this country needs." Elisabeta leaned into his embrace, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. "It's all still so surreal sometimes," she admitted. "To think that we have the power to change so many lives." "It's a great responsibility," Darius agreed, "but one I'm grateful to share with you." Later that evening, as they prepared for bed, Elisabeta found herself lost in thought. Darius, ever attuned to her moods, noticed her distraction. "What's on your mind, my love?" he asked, coming to sit beside her at the dressing table. Elisabeta met his gaze in the mirror. "I was just thinking about how far we've come," she said softly. "A year ago I was a servant and you were a tyrant." Darius finished for her, a wry smile on his lips. She turned to face him, taking his hands in hers. "No, never that. Misguided perhaps, lonely. But I always saw the good in you, Darius, even when you couldn't see it yourself." He raised her hands to his lips, pressing a tender kiss to her knuckles. "You saved me, Elisabeta, in more ways than you know." "We saved each other," she corrected gently. "And now together, we're saving Romania." As they settled into bed, Darius pulled Elisabeta close. "I have something to tell you," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "I received word today from our spies in Bulgaria. It seems King Stefan is intrigued by our reforms. He's requested a meeting to discuss a possible alliance." Elisabeta's eyes widened in surprise. Bulgaria had long been a rival of Romania, their relations frosty at best. An alliance? That's unexpected. Do you think it's genuine? Darius sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not sure. It could be a tremendous opportunity for both our kingdoms, but it could also be a trap. Stefan has never been known for his trustworthiness." "Then we'll approach it cautiously," Elisabeta said, her mind already racing with possibilities. "But if there's a chance for peace, for cooperation, we have to explore it, don't we?" Darius nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "My thoughts exactly. I've arranged for Stefan to visit in a month's time. We'll have to be on our guard, but who knows? Perhaps our changes here in Romania will inspire similar reforms in Bulgaria." As they drifted off to sleep, Elisabeta's mind whirled with visions of the future. Schools rising across the countryside, hospitals bringing healing to the sick, and now the possibility of peace with their closest neighbor. The challenges ahead were daunting, but with Darius by her side, she felt ready to face anything. The story of the servant girl and the once cruel king had evolved into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. They were no longer just rulers, but visionaries, working tirelessly to create a better world for all their people. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Elisabeta snuggled closer to Darius, feeling a profound sense of gratitude and purpose. Whatever the future held, be it triumph or challenge, they would face it together, their love for each other and for their kingdom growing stronger with each passing day. The day of King Stefan's arrival dawned bright and clear, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of spring blossoms through the castle grounds. Elisabeta stood on the balcony of the royal chambers, watching as servants scurried about below, making last-minute preparations for their distinguished guest. Darius joined her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Are you ready for this, my love?" he asked softly. Elisabeta leaned into his embrace, drawing strength from his presence. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied. "There's so much at stake. If we can forge this alliance, it could change everything," Darius finished for her. "Not just for Romania and Bulgaria, but for the entire region." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Finally, Elisabeta turned to face her husband, her expression serious. "Darius," she began hesitantly, "there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you. Something important." His brow furrowed with concern. "What is it, Elisabeta? You know you can tell me anything." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. I think I might be with child." For a moment, Darius simply stared at her, his eyes wide with shock. Then, a slow smile spread across his face, lighting up his features in a way Elisabeta had never seen before. "A child?" he breathed, his voice filled with wonder. "Are you certain?" Elisabeta nodded, tears of joy pricking at her eyes. "The royal physician confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to be sure before I told you." In an instant, Darius had swept her into his arms, spinning her around with a laugh of pure joy. "Oh, my love," he murmured, pressing fervent kisses to her face. "You've made me the happiest man in all the world." As he set her down gently, his expression grew more serious. "But why didn't you tell me sooner? And are you sure you're up for this meeting with Stefan? If you're not feeling well?" Elisabeta silenced him with a gentle finger to his lips. "I'm fine, Darius. The physician says I'm in perfect health, and I didn't want to distract you from the important matters at hand. This alliance with Bulgaria could shape the future of our child, of all the children in Romania." Darius nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're right, of course, as always." He placed a tender hand on her still flat stomach. "But promise me you'll take care of yourself. You and this little one are more precious to me than any treaty." Before Elisabeta could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted their intimate moment. Theodore entered, looking flustered. "Your Majesties," he said, bowing low, "King Stefan's carriage has been spotted approaching the castle gates. He'll be here within the hour." Darius straightened, his face assuming the mask of regal authority that Elisabeta had come to know so well. "Thank you, Theodore. We'll be down shortly to greet him." As they made their final preparations, Elisabeta couldn't help but feel a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. So much was riding on this meeting. Could they truly forge an alliance with a kingdom that had long been their rival? And how would Stefan react to the changes they had implemented in Romania? The great hall was a flurry of activity as nobles and servants alike rushed to take their places. Elisabeta and Darius stood at the foot of the grand staircase, presenting a united front as the massive doors swung open to reveal King Stefan of Bulgaria. Stefan was a tall, imposing figure with piercing green eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. He strode into the hall with confidence, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd before settling on the royal couple. "King Darius, Queen Elisabeta," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hushed hall. "I thank you for your hospitality." Darius stepped forward, extending a hand in greeting. "Welcome to Romania, King Stefan. We are honored by your visit and look forward to productive discussions." As the formalities of the welcome ceremony were observed, Elisabeta found herself studying Stefan closely. There was a shrewdness in his eyes that made her wary, but also a hint of curiosity, perhaps even admiration. Later, as they sat down to a lavish feast in Stefan's honor, the real negotiations began. Elisabeta listened intently as Darius and Stefan discussed trade agreements, border disputes, and the possibility of mutual defense pacts. "I must admit," Stefan said, leaning back in his chair, "when I first heard of the changes you were implementing here in Romania, I was skeptical. But the reports I've received, well, they're quite impressive. Your people seem genuinely happy. Darius nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. It hasn't been without its challenges, he admitted. But we believe that a kingdom is only as strong as its people. By investing in education, healthcare, and fair governance, we're building a foundation for lasting prosperity. Stefan's gaze shifted to Elisabeta. And I understand much of this was your idea, Your Majesty. Quite remarkable for someone of your background. Elisabeta felt Darius tense beside her, but she laid a calming hand on his arm. My background is precisely why these reforms are so important to me, King Stefan, she said, her voice steady and clear. I've seen firsthand the struggles of the common people, but I've also seen their potential, their resilience. Given the opportunity, there's no limit to what they can achieve. For a long moment, Stefan simply studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, he let out a hearty laugh. Well said, Queen Elisabeta, he chuckled. I can see why you've captured not just Darius's heart, but the hearts of your people as well. He raised his goblet in a toast to new beginnings and unexpected alliances. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the great hall grew more relaxed. Elisabeta found herself deep in conversation with Stefan about the intricacies of implementing widespread education reforms. The resistance from the nobility has been our biggest challenge, she explained. Many fear that educating the common people will lead to unrest. Stefan nodded thoughtfully. We've faced similar issues in Bulgaria. But perhaps it's time for a change there as well. He glanced at Darius, who was engaged in conversation with one of the Bulgarian advisors. Your husband has shown remarkable adaptability. The Darius I knew years ago would never have considered such progressive policies. Elisabeta smiled softly. People can surprise you, King Stefan. Sometimes they just need to be given the chance. As the feast drew to a close, Darius called for attention. My friends, he said, his voice carrying over the murmur of conversation, I believe we have the makings of a historic agreement here. King Stefan has expressed interest in not just an alliance between our kingdoms, but in implementing some of our reforms in Bulgaria as well. A ripple of excitement ran through the hall. Stefan stood, raising his goblet once more. Indeed, he said, Romania has shown us a new path forward, one of cooperation, education, and shared prosperity. I propose we spend the next few days hammering out the details of this alliance. Together, we can usher in a new era of peace and progress for both our kingdoms. The hall erupted in cheers and applause. As Elisabeta looked around at the beaming faces of nobles and servants alike, she felt a surge of hope and pride. This was what they had been working towards, not just improving life within Romania, but spreading their vision of a better world beyond their borders. Later that night, as she and Darius prepared for bed, Elisabeta could hardly contain her excitement. Can you believe it? She said, her eyes shining. An alliance with Bulgaria. It's more than we ever dared hope for. Darius pulled her close, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead. It's all thanks to you, my love. Your compassion, your vision. You've changed not just me, not just Romania, but perhaps the entire region. Elisabeta placed a hand on her stomach, thinking of the child growing within her. We're building a better world, she said softly, for our child and for all the children of Romania and Bulgaria. As they drifted off to sleep, Elisabeta's mind was filled with visions of the future. Schools and hospitals rising across both kingdoms, trade and ideas flowing freely across once closed borders, and a lasting peace that would allow their people to flourish. The story of the servant girl and the once cruel king had become a legend, a tale of love, redemption, and the power of compassion to change the world. And as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, heralding the beginning of a new day and a new era, Elisabeta knew that their greatest chapters were still to come. In the years that followed, Romania and Bulgaria would indeed enter a golden age of peace and prosperity. The alliance forged that night would grow to include other neighboring kingdoms, creating a network of cooperation and shared knowledge that would transform the entire region. Elisabeta and Darius's child, a daughter they named Sophia, would grow to be a wise and compassionate ruler in her own right. carrying on her parents' legacy of progressive governance and unwavering dedication to the welfare of all people, regardless of their birth or station. And though challenges would always arise, as they do in any great endeavor, the foundation of love, trust, and shared purpose that Elisabeta and Darius had built would prove unshakable. Their story would be told for generations, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and love have the power to change the world.